Hello, and welcome back to part two of our job order costing lecture series. In this video, we're going to talk about manufacturing overhead. Now, in our prior video, we saw how we are easily and conveniently able to trace direct material costs as well as direct labor costs. So in this video, we're going to see how do we allocate manufacturing overhead. Remember, let me ask you this. What is manufacturing overhead? Hopefully you said, or you're thinking at least, hey, manufacturing overhead is all my indirect costs, my indirect material, my indirect labor. Okay, so in order for us to allocate that manufacturing overhead, we need to learn the predetermined overhead rate. So by the time you complete this video, you should be able to explain what is the predetermined overhead rate, and you should also be able to calculate this predetermined overhead rate. Okay, so the first thing we need to really understand is why in the world are we going to use an allocation base, right? Well, we know we use an allocation base because we have indirect costs. Manufacturing overhead are indirect costs. There are the indirect materials and indirect labor, right? Because they're indirect, that makes it nearly impossible or extremely difficult to trace those costs to a particular cost object or to a particular job. Now, if we think about manufacturing overhead as an umbrella, right? Well, what's under that umbrella? Well, there's a ton of different costs under there. We have all the indirect materials, right? Well, what are our indirect materials? These are the materials that we use to either produce a product or provide a service that are not easily and conveniently traced to a specific unit of a product or a job. So, grease, right? In chapter 1, we used the example of making a bicycle, right? Well, think about it. The grease that we use to grease up the sprockets and the chains to put on that bicycle, yeah, we can't easily and conveniently trace the cost of grease to each bike. So guess what? We lump it in as a manufacturing overhead, okay? Indirect labor, right? Let's say like the production manager, or let's say the security staff for the production plant, right? We have security in the production plant. We got a person that drives around the plant making sure, nobody's climbing the fence or trying to get in that isn't supposed to be there, right? That's indirect costs. We can't easily and conveniently trace those costs to a unit of a product or a service. So because of that, we lump it in as manufacturing overhead, okay? So remember, we have a number of different overhead costs that are not easily traceable, and these overhead costs are going to fluctuate, right, over time. Why? Well, because some of these manufacturing overhead costs can either be variable or they can be fixed. Okay, so they're going to have different elements of behavior. Okay, so a lot of these costs are going to be fixed and they're going to fluctuate from period to period. Okay, so keep that in mind. So that's really why we use an allocation base. Now, what do we use as an allocation base? Well, we can use one of three things. We can use direct labor hours, we can use machine hours, or you may see in some of the problems we could use direct labor dollars. So those are the three allocation bases. Those are the three ways that we allocate, and keep in mind we're only going to use one of the three, to allocate that overhead cost to a specific job. Now, what is the predetermined overhead rate? Okay, the predetermined overhead rate is what we use to actually apply jobs to overhead. Okay, so before we can even apply it to the jobs, we need to figure out what is the predetermined overhead rate. Okay, now we always calculate the predetermined overhead rate before the period begins. Okay, so since we are allocating it before the period begins, guess what? We have to use estimates. So this is very important that you remember, understand that we do this, we calculate the predetermined overhead rate at the beginning of the period, and B, we got to use estimates. Why? Well, think about it. We have somebody that comes to us at the beginning of the year and says, hey, we want you to build a job for us, or build a house for us, or do a job for us. Okay, how much is it going to cost me? Hold on. The customer asks, how much is it going to cost me? Meaning, what's the price of this job, right? How much are we, as the manufacturer or the service provider, going to charge this person? Well, how do we come up with a price, right? We can just pull a number out of the air and say, 20 bucks. Well, is that revenue of $20 that we charge for this job going to cover our cost? So we as manufacturers have to have an idea or an estimate of what our costs are going to be, so we can then price that out to our clients and say, yeah, I can build you a mansion. I'm going to charge you $1.2 million based on your specifications. And based on your specifications, we think it's going to cost us internally to buy, or to get the materials, the labor, apply the overhead that we need. That's going to cost us $1 million, right? So we're actually generating a profit here by charging 1.2, and it's only costing us $1 million. Okay. Excuse me. So how do we calculate this? Well, again, we got to use estimates. If I were you, I would definitely write this down. Okay. The predetermined overhead rate is calculated by taking the estimated total manufacturing overhead cost for the coming period, and we divide that by the estimated total units in the allocation base for that coming period. Okay, meaning we take the estimated total manufacturing overhead cost for the coming period, and we divide that by the estimated total direct labor hours that we're going to incur in the coming period. Or we take the estimated total manufacturing overhead cost for the coming period, and we divide that by the estimated total machine hours that will be incurred in the coming period. Or we could take the estimated total manufacturing overhead cost for the coming period, and we divide that by the estimated total direct labor dollars that we estimate for the coming period. Okay, so you got to know that. You got to know that cold, right? Meaning, if you see a question, how do you calculate the predetermined overhead rate? You got to know that equation, and you got to be able to plug the numbers in. Okay, now in our course, we're going to tell you what the allocation base always is. It's either going to be direct labor hours, machine hours, or direct labor dollars. However, in the real world, it's always a great idea that you pick an allocation base that actually drives the cost, meaning what causes the overhead. We have all this overhead cost, right? Where did this overhead cost come from? Did it come from us using machines? Then we should use machine hours. Did it come from, we have all this overhead as a result of all this indirect labor that we have? Well, then guess what? We should use either direct labor hours or direct labor dollars to allocate that estimated overhead. Okay, so theoretically, you want to pick a driver that actually or a cost driver that causes those costs. Okay, however, in this course, in the problems, we're going to tell you what the allocation base is. Okay, all right. So again, we already talked about this, we already discussed this, the need for the predetermined overhead rate. Again, costs are going to fluctuate from season to season, right? So we need to allocate, or sorry, we need to estimate those in the beginning of the period. We don't know what the actual costs are going to be that are going to be incurred are, but we have an idea, okay? So that allows us to estimate the cost of the job so we can then price that out, okay? All right, so how do we compute this predetermined overhead rate? Okay, there's 4 steps. Okay, there's 4 steps to calculate the predetermined overhead rate. First thing you got to do is you got to estimate, or you got to figure out, what are our total allocation bases, right? Meaning, what's the denominator? If we're using direct labor hours, how many direct labor hours do we anticipate using in the coming period? Okay, how many if we're using machine hours? Hey, how many machine hours do we guesstimate using in the coming period? Okay. The second thing you need to do is you need to figure out what is our total manufacturing overhead. Okay. What is the total manufacturing overhead? In order to do that, we need to do 2 things. First, or 2A if you're looking at the slide, we need to be able to estimate what are the total fixed overhead costs, right? What's the total fixed overhead cost? We also need to figure out or guesstimate, hey, what's the total variable manufacturing overhead cost per unit? Okay. Now when I say per unit, I mean per unit of the allocation base. So if the allocation base is direct labor hours, okay, what's the variable manufacturing overhead cost per direct labor hour? If it's machine hours, what's the variable manufacturing overhead cost per direct labor hour, or I'm sorry, per machine hour? Okay. Then we need to, which if you're following the slide, this would be 2B, or actually number 3 really. We need to use that equation that we saw in chapter 1. How do we figure out total cost when we have a mixed cost? Well, we have a fixed portion, we have a variable portion. We need to use our y equals a plus b times x formula. And then finally, we compute the predetermined overhead rate. Okay, so one of the objectives of this video was, hey, how do we compute the predetermined overhead rate? Well, we have 4 steps, right? Estimate what the total amount of the allocation base is, estimate the fixed, or the total fixed manufacturing overhead, or estimate the variable manufacturing overhead cost per unit of the allocation base, use our equation to estimate what the total amount of the manufacturing overhead is, and then finally compute the predetermined overhead rate. How do we compute the predetermined overhead rate? We already know that. Estimated total cost divided by our estimated allocation base. So very simple on how to calculate the predetermined overhead rate. Later we will work on exercise 14 in your study guide, which is actually calculating the predetermined overhead rate. So right now I wanted you guys to theoretically understand, why do we use a predetermined overhead rate? What are the steps? Okay, when we come back a little later, we're going to apply all this concepts and theories that we learned to actual concrete numbers. Okay, so what are our takeaways from this video? Well, again, takeaways are, why do we use an allocation base? Well, we know why, right? Because of the nature of manufacturing overhead, meaning because they're indirect, it's difficult to trace, and because there's a number of costs within manufacturing overhead, as well as the fact that, hey, these manufacturing overhead costs, a lot of them are going to be fixed and they're going to fluctuate with output throughout the period. We need to know, how do we calculate it, meaning what's the formula? We got it right here. We wrote it down. We're going to study this and memorize this. We know, ideally, what cost driver should we choose? Well, we should choose something that actually causes the overhead cost. But in our book, in our problems, on the exam, in our homework problems, they're going to tell us what the allocation base is. Okay? We know why we need to use the predetermined overhead rate, and we also know our 4 steps, right? The 4 steps that we need, the 4 steps that we need in order to calculate or compute that predetermined overhead rate. Now, when we come back in our 3rd video, we're going to look at how do we actually apply the cost, or apply the overhead cost to a job using what we already calculated, this predetermined overhead rate. So please tune back in for that video.